Hey, DawgNation, happy Thursday. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We have a lot coming up for you on today's show as we get ready for the upcoming 2019 season. We'll also look ahead to the 2020 schedule on today's program as well. We'll have an interesting look with our buddy John Stinchcomb and what happens for Georgia after Jake Fromm at quarterback. What's the backup situation like, and what were to occur in the event that Fromm might have even a minor injury? We'll deal with that. I'll remind you I also wrote about that at DawgNation.com as well. But we begin the show this way. I think pretty secretly and maybe kind of quietly, Georgia's building up one of its position groups in a way that most of the national media hasn't noticed yet, and it may be a big-time ally if the Dogs take on Alabama again in the SEC Championship. I'll tell you all about that next as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We have a fun guest coming up. A national writer has predicted that Georgia will win the national championship this year. That's obviously a topic of interest to us around here. We will discuss that coming up here today on today's program. And yes, as you might imagine, for those of you that watch or listen every day, I have been almost fixated like Alex Jones-like with this change to the 2020 schedule. I've got some more thoughts on that now that we have seen the full 2020 schedule for the Dogs. We'll deal with that a little bit later on in our program. Let me begin, though, with this. I read this online, and I felt like it deserved maybe a little bit of a rebuttal. Not because it makes me mad. I don't get mad about stuff like this, but I just think it's not necessarily the full story. Alex Scarborough, a writer that I like for ESPN.com, has this headline on ESPN.com that there's, his words, no stopping Alabama's wide receivers. You go to ESPN.com, you can read that story for yourself, all about the terrific crop of Alabama wide receivers and how there's no stopping them this year. He means that figuratively, and he's probably exaggerating to make a point, but nonetheless, those two words, no stopping, kind of got me thinking. Well, gosh, what's the point of Georgia even fielding up and suiting up a team this year if there's truly no stopping the Alabama wide receivers? And admittedly, that's a really impressive group. It was impressive in 2017. We all know how that season ended. You had Jalen Waddle in the mix in 2018. He was a load to deal with in the SEC Championship game a year ago. So, gosh, if there's no stopping the Alabama wide receivers, then we might as well, with the 2020 schedule being released, we might as well just look ahead to that year when some of these guys are maybe hopefully gone to the NFL or whatever else. What's the point of playing here in 2019? And now I'm the one that's also exaggerating to make a point because I believe that maybe there actually might be some stopping of the Alabama receivers this year. And frankly, I think the Georgia defensive backs might be just the unit to get that done. Because here's the one thing that I continue to notice. I believe that Kirby Smart actually feels pretty good about the current state of this group. And that flies against what the national media might typically assume is true because for the most part, guy who writes for major website, guy who writes for big preseason magazine, anything from kind of that old guard of sports writer, there's pretty much the assumption of returning starters mean greatness and the absence of a big-time returning starter means there could be a huge problem. DeAndre Baker won the Thorpe Award for 2018. Now he's gone to the NFL. He plays the New York Giants, and the obvious storyline is, well, Georgia's going to have all kinds of problems figuring out a way to replace him. And to be honest, I actually started the spring thinking that might indeed be the case, but over the course of that time, my opinion of this evolved because of the things that Kirby Smart said about his secondary. So keep this in mind as we talk about these supposed unstoppable Alabama wide receivers, that just this week alone, Kirby Smart was asked a question that somehow goes kind of like this. Hey, I know you're having to revamp your secondary with DeAndre Baker not being there, and Smart essentially stopped that question and said, my perspective of the secondary is apparently far different than some in the media. Here's what Smart said on Friday.
You'd say revamped. I wouldn't say revamped. I feel like we've got a lot of guys coming back that have played a lot of snaps, and I'm excited about those guys. I mean, when you look at it, the group that we went out with there in the bowl game with is the group we're playing with now. So a lot of those guys have gained experience. We've got some really good competition in that room. So I'm excited about those guys. They're a year older. We were really young, I felt like, last year in the secondary and new. And this year we've got some more experienced players. And Best players are going to get to play, and the guys that kind of buy into the principles and values, they're going to be the guys that play for us.
So most of y'all have obviously been around, heard just about everything that Kirby Smart has said about any Georgia player, any Georgia position group. And here's the thing that you already know without me telling you. Kirby Smart does not throw compliments around lightly. First of all, because people like me who kind of have a little bit too much of a hyperbole gene in them probably anyway, people like me just take that stuff and run with it. I mean, so Kirby Smart's always going to be careful about the kind of compliments that he throws around because he knows how the average fan, the average media member is going to respond to that kind of stuff. So when Kirby Smart says, listen, I don't want this secondary called revamped. I actually feel really good about the experience these guys have gained. Some of that was over the course of a year, like Tyson Campbell, who very well may be a starter. Some of that was short-term near the end of last year, like Devod Wilson, who got a chance to play a lot in the Sugar Bowl. Some of that was Eric Stokes, who stepped in second half of the year and kind of became a starter. Kirby Smart says, I actually feel pretty good about the experience we had, and all of these guys, including DJ Daniel and Tyreek Stevenson, they all got a chance to go through spring practice. So I had my hands on them even back then, and I've been at these practices and I've seen that. Kirby Smart is among the more active coaches on this Georgia coaching roster. This is not the 1970s where Bear Bryant sat up on some tower 50 feet in the air looking down on practice. Kirby Smart is, what was the word that Lanning used the other day? Encouraging folks. Kirby Smart's doing a lot of hand-on-hand encouragement with these defensive backs, and I think he's pretty happy with the way that he's kind of coaching these guys up right now. Which sort of leads me back to the ESPN story that I mentioned before about the Alabama wide receivers. Part of the reason why the writer here says this group may be, his word, no stopping, unstoppable this year, is the way in which they're described by Xavier McKinney, a really good Alabama defensive back. He, over again in this interview with Scarborough, the ESPN writer, talks about how super fast all these guys are. And we know that. Judy is a blazer. I mentioned Waddle before. He's probably the fastest of the group, to say nothing of Henry Ruggs, Devontae Smith. This is a super, super fast Alabama wide receiving core, and for most teams in the country, it's going to be overwhelming speed. But for Georgia, that might not necessarily be the case. Let me take you back to the spring for a moment. As I said before, it was during those spring practices that my opinion of the Georgia secondary started to evolve. Initially concerned, boy, replacing DeAndre Baker, that might prove to be as hard as replacing Roquan Smith was after the 2017 season. But Smart's own words convinced me different. So we just heard an Alabama player talking about how super fast the Alabama wide receiver core is. Well, listen to Kirby Smart evaluating these guys back in the spring, saying, here's the one thing I know about my group right now as well. Kirby again.
We've had a good spring. I don't know if that's a credit to the young secondary or whether that's a lack of depth at receiver. Probably didn't have our best day today. We gave up some plays on the back end. I mean, more than we did the last week. But those kids grow. They're growing. I mean, what you know is we've got what we're going to have. There's nobody else coming, so it's very unique that we have depth and we're able to move people around and try to figure out the best parts. And, you're really trying to get the guys that don't know what they're doing to be able to do that. There's a few guys that have played a lot of snaps here with the likes of Stokes and Tyson and JR and even Richard. Those four guys played a lot of snaps. So we're trying to get those other guys ready to go play. And the good thing is they're here to get these reps. I think that's going to pay off for us in the fall. I think we have the potential to have a very fast secondary. I don't know how instinctive we are yet. I don't know how great we are at playing the ball, but we do have some speed back there.
Did you hear those words there at the end? Fast secondary. We've got some speed, and he doesn't mean a mere speed, although speed is a part of the secondary group right now. He means a descriptor of speed for a lot of these guys. So ESPN touts the Alabama receivers, how fast they are. Kirby Smart, quiet as kept, says, you know what, I feel pretty good about my group here too. Even back during the spring, you look at a Tyson Campbell who may be blossoming. You look at some of the incoming freshmen like a Tyreek Stevenson. You look at what some of these guys do, and Kirby Smart says, I feel like my guys can run because that's why I recruited them. I recruited them to run alongside these Alabama receivers and potentially match up with guys like Justin Ross and T. Higgins for Clemson, were you to get that point in the college football playoff. And with that said, let me kind of transition this conversation just for a moment, because I think for me, this is more than just what could be a one-year battle or a one-game battle where the Dogs and the Tide to meet back up again in the SEC championship of the college football playoff. I think one of the unspoken narratives in recruiting right now is that as much as we talk about the lines of scrimmage and we know how important those are, it's really how good you are in your defensive secondary to match up against these top-flight receivers that all the national championship contenders seem to be stockpiling right now. That goes a long way to determining your ability to compete with national championships over the long haul. And that's one of the reasons why I think Georgia has been so motivated to add as many top-flight defensive backs as it can. In 2020, huge target for a guy like Keely Ringo, the Dogs hope to get, Jalen Kimber, who's already in the fold, and Jeff Sentell gave us a surprise yesterday on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger about maybe another big-time defensive back, maybe suddenly being in the mix with Georgia because of a friendship. It was a surprise to me to hear Jeff say this, but it also kind of makes sense given the context I just provided of big, fast defensive backs running with the nation's best wide receivers. Here's Jeff from yesterday.
Wouldn't be shocked at all if Elias Ricks takes an official visit to Georgia. Of course, there's a great kinship there with Kendall Milton, the five-star running back. If some fashion Georgia was able to end up with Elias Ricks in the signing class, when all of a sudden all those mock-ups and mock classes that go from 6 or 7 5-stars might elevate by one more, but big picture there would be Keely Ringo potentially, Elias Ricks potentially nation's number 2 corner, and also Jalen Kimber, who's the number 5 cornerback in the country for 2020. And those are possibilities now for this Georgia recruiting staff.
So listen, let me bottom line this really quick. I don't know if Georgia is going to get Elias Ricks. It sounds like Jeff's got some pretty good sourcing on this. He wouldn't mention if it wasn't a strong possibility. It seems like a pretty big recruiting upset for me were that to happen, but I get where Jeff is coming from. On yesterday's show, he went on to say, if you want to battle the Alabamas and the Clemsons, that's what you do. You got to be great at every position, but right now in particular, it might be defensive back as much as anything else. Sounds like Kirby Smart feels like he's got a pretty good group in place for 2019. And he's working on putting an even deeper and better group together for 2020 and beyond. Hello, everybody. Welcome to DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. My name is Brandon Adams, and I'm really glad to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 10 a.m. on the DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just really glad to have you with us today. Let me give you a taste of what's coming up on our program. Later on, we'll hear from our buddy John Stinchcomb as a part of our continuing series of how Georgia can own the East and a whole lot more this season, courtesy of our friends at Georgia's own credit union. We'll look at the quarterback situation behind Jake Fromm in that discussion today. Hope you'll stick around for that. Also, in a moment, we'll talk to our buddy Barrett Sallee from CBSSports.com. Barrett has predicted Georgia to win the national championship, and we'll find out from him exactly how he thinks that's going to take place and get a little bit more detail from him on the path he thinks the Dogs will travel down to get to that point. Fun to have Barrett Sallee back on the program from CBS Sports. We'll do that coming up in just a couple of minutes. For now, though, let's go around the doghouse, presented today by my friends at Online Trading Academy. And there was a big piece of news yesterday for Georgia involving the 2020 season, despite the fact the 2019 season hasn't even kicked off yet. We got the schedule. We've known for a while this was going to be a little bit of a different schedule for Georgia, and we found out yesterday just how different it's going to be. I think for our folks watching on video, we can throw this up here. Headlines, Georgia plays a game on a Monday night to start the season against Virginia. Dogs haven't done that a ton over the course of years because Monday night's not typically a college football night. Georgia travels to Alabama for the first time since 2007. They'll do that early September. That's the SEC opener here. As been talked about a lot, the Auburn game is now no longer a November tradition for Georgia. That's now October 10th. That means in its place in the month of November, you've got Tennessee. I almost said 14th ranked Tennessee, but it's the date that they're playing, November 14th. I can confuse myself with my own graphic. Apparently, it'd be quite a story if Tennessee's 14th in the country next season. But nonetheless, I guess it's at least some sort of possibility. And for those of you with young kids, this is not great news. For the first time in a while, the cocktail party does rotate back to on October 31st. So I'm going to be sleeping on the couch for about a month after my wife has to do Halloween without me next year, but that's kind of the story on that. However, the big issue becomes what's going to go on with the Auburn game and the move up, and y'all know I've had a little bit of a problem with this. Let me remind you what Greg McGarity said about this. I was going to play some Kirby audio. We'll just say this for McGarity right now. Let me remind you what McGarity said when I questioned him about why Georgia was willing to go along with the change for Auburn. Here's what McGarity said at the time when I had a chance to discuss this with him.
Well, I think once the schedules are announced, a lot of questions will be answered. I would just say be careful what you wish for in some situations because we know what the schedules look like. Okay. We've seen it. So some school may want to do X, Y, or Z. Well, there are a lot of unintended consequences with that because it's not to where one school has an advantage. Mm-hmm. I think once it's announced that I know there's some concern about tradition and the time, the segment of time in there, but if that game's at a different time for us and it works and Kirby's comfortable with it, we're okay with it.
So listen, I know there's some Georgia fans who are laughing now at Auburn here because what they thought, at least in the minds of some Georgia fans, was a trade with Georgia to make things easier, has made things about the same because now Auburn's going to play LSU, at least in 2020, ahead of playing Alabama. And I think that's just the wrong impression, the wrong way of looking at this. Auburn got exactly what it wanted. It knew it'd play somebody tough. It's an SEC schedule, by all means. What Auburn did not want were the two big road games in November, and they don't have that anymore. By comparison, even looking at this 2020 schedule, which is not necessarily bad, it's just different, but when you look at the trade that Georgia made with Auburn, for me, it's still hard to know what Georgia got out of this because next year the Tennessee game is a home game. But in 2021, it's going to be a road game again, and by that time, Tennessee could be a much better team, and all of a sudden the Georgia schedule doesn't quite feel quite as relieved there in the month of November. I think there is still a lot that needs to be done to explain what Georgia's cooperation in all of this was all about because so far, I'm not quite getting this, but I know there'll be plenty of talk about that coming up in the months to come. It's Around the Doghouse. It's presented by Online Trading Academy. I'll invite you to make the best decision you can make, the decision to invest in yourself by learning how the markets work. That's both in the classroom and online. That's what Online Trading Academy provides across a spectrum of trading styles and a variety of asset classes. We all want more money. Learning how to make the markets work for you is the way to get that money. So please check out Online Trading Academy online at tradingacademy.com/Atlanta. That's trading with a D, tradingacademy.com/Atlanta. All right, we've got John Stinchcomb as a part of Own the East later on. For now, though, for more on the 2020 Georgia schedule and how the Dogs could win the national championship in 2019, let's talk to our buddy Barrett Sallee. CBS Sports is where you can find his written work on Twitter at Barrett Sallee, always active and a part of the college football conversation is where you can find him on Twitter there. It is Barrett Sallee from CBS Sports back here today on DawgNation Daily. And Barrett, we certainly appreciate your time, and I'm sure you're like me. All of those kind of final quarter polls have been turned around. It really feels like we're staring the start of the college football season square in the face. I'm certainly excited about that, and I'm sure that you are as well.
Yeah, I am. And first things first, BA, congratulations on your 1,000th show. I mean, you and I have been friends for a very long time, and for you to find a way to do what you love and do it every single day and do it as well as you do, better than anybody else in the country, I'm really happy for you, man. Like, this is it's been a great show and more to come for sure. Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's real now, because the weird thing is, BA, and I was thinking about this, I'm going to Orlando to cover the Miami-Florida game, which is week 0. Everybody else already has 2 bye weeks built in, and the national championship game is 2.5 weeks after the semifinals.
Yeah.
This is one hell of a long football season, man. Like, it is going to be so much fun, and yeah, there's really nothing to hold us back at this point. The only thing that comes out between now and the start of the season are quarterback decisions and injuries, and hopefully the latter does not happen to any team that you follow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And first of all, thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate that. And I'll return the favor by saying, if you go back and look at 2017, you were kind of the national media anyway, kind of first through the door on expecting big things from Kirby Smart. You correctly picked the SEC that year, including Georgia beating Auburn in the SEC championship, and you've kind of doubled down on that prediction for 2019. If people go and see your Twitter account at Barrett Sallee, you've got Georgia winning the national championship. So I can say that for most of my audience, that's exactly where they'd want us to start our conversation. So give me a little bit of a thumbnail sketch, if you don't mind, about how you think all this goes down for Georgia this year, what you like about them and what you might have a little bit of a concern about that might make you at least consider second-guessing your opinion.
Well, obviously the linebacking core with what happened with Britton Cox is something to at least be concerned about, although I do think that there are plenty of guys on that roster, some who have played, some who haven't, that will be able to fill those shoes just fine, especially considering there are 3 games to sort of get comfortable before Notre Dame comes into town. So, yeah, I mean, that would be the concern. But, I mean, let's be honest, like the recruiting that Kirby Smart has done, really just taking it up 3 or 4 levels from what Mark Richt did, which Mark Richt was good, not great. Georgia is Alabama and Clemson. They are a team right now that can just throw somebody else out there and have as much success as they had before. Bud Elliott, who works for SB Nation and that new site, the Banner Society, came out with the blue chip rankings. Came out today, in fact, and it's a really good look as to which teams have the talent to win a national championship based on recruiting rankings and overall team talent. And Georgia's third behind Clemson and Alabama, and they're a whole hell of a lot closer to third. To second than they are to fourth, which is LSU. So that tells me something that I've been saying a long time ago is that there is Georgia is in that tier with Georgia and Clemson. It just doesn't have the title yet, so it's trailing a little bit behind, but only a little bit. So I mean, the way it's going to work out to me, I mean, who's going to beat Georgia on its roster? I mean, I don't see a team that's going to do it. I mean, Notre Dame's going to be good. I think the best team that they face will be Notre Dame, and I know folks are always polarized on the Irish, and they either love them or hate them, but the truth of the matter is they're still probably a 10-win team. They're still pretty darn good. And so get past that, and I think they will, where the loss is coming from. There aren't any. So the way I have it figured out, and you can see the video pinned to the top of my Twitter page where we break it down, I've got Georgia and Alabama both undefeated in Atlanta. Alabama beating Georgia, going into the playoff as the number 2 seed behind Clemson, number 3 Ohio State, and then 4 Georgia. Because when I do this, BA, I kind of get those helmet schedules and I kind of mark win, mark loss, because I don't want to give 2 teams a win in the same game or whatever. So the way I had it worked out, there were no other 1 or no loss teams in Power 5 football. So by virtue of how I had it worked out, Georgia was the only option to get in at the 4th spot. And like I said, the talent is there, the coaching is there. I think Kirby Smart needs to learn from some of his mistakes. Because he doesn't really know when to go for that home run ball as a coach, make that one decision that will turn the tide and really dictate the game, and he will find that eventually, and I think it happens this year.
So that's really interesting. There's a lot to unpack from that. The thing I'm going to focus on for a moment is what makes your prediction different than some of the other media is the fact that you've got Georgia winning it all, but obviously you're not the only one that will have Georgia as a second SEC team going into the playoff with Alabama. And the thing that I've been skeptical about a little bit, Barrett, is if Georgia could get the same benefit of the doubt that Alabama got in 2017. Alabama, to its credit, won national championships. They've got a national brand. They've been in every playoff. Georgia's only been in the playoff up to this point 1 time. So I'm kind of the belief that if Georgia is going to be in the playoff and win it all, they're actually going to have to vanquish Alabama, or it could be LSU. That's been kind of my suggestion. But one way or another, they're going to have to vanquish a foe in the SEC championship game. I just don't think Georgia yet has earned the national credit to make it as a second SEC team the way that Alabama got the nod ahead of Ohio State going back to 2017. How would you respond to that?
Well, maybe. But, when you talk about college football playoff, Final Four predictions, you can't factor in landscape, right? Like,
Sure.
You can't sit there and say, okay, well, Georgia's not going to get that street cred because we don't know who they're fighting against and we don't know what that resume is, right? So last year is a perfect example of exactly what you meant. Georgia was one of the top 4 teams in the country last year. They just didn't have the top 4 resume. I mean, they just flat out didn't, especially considering Oklahoma beat every team on its schedule. It just had to take 2 times to beat Texas. So, I think that is absolutely out there. And if there is a debate between Georgia and somebody else, then they're probably not going to get the benefit of the doubt, like the same benefit of the doubt anyway as Clemson or Alabama does. But just like I said, for me, the way it worked out, and I didn't even mean to do this, but there were really no other options. It would be a 1-loss Georgia that played its way into a loss by winning the SEC East, earning a bonus game. It played its way into its only loss of the season, whereas everybody else has 2 or more. And you're not going to take a 2-loss Oklahoma or Texas. You're not going to take a 2-loss Oregon over a 1-loss Georgia that went undefeated in the regular season.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. Let me transition and talk about something else for a moment. You got a tweet about the change to the SEC schedule for 2020 that I thought was interesting. A little backstory on this. I've been a little bit critical of Georgia's willingness to seemingly cooperate with Auburn for something that it wanted. I won't relitigate that point for the 9 millionth time. But you said something on Twitter that I thought was really interesting, that the SEC East, due to the fact that a lot of these teams have in-state rivals that are not conference foes, Georgia, Kentucky, Florida, South Carolina. The SEC East race is typically settled well before you get to the second half of the final month of the season. And with this new schedule, that's not going to quite be the case as much anymore. Georgia playing Tennessee late November, for instance. I will admit that's a situation that I hadn't quite thought about, and I guess I would be curious to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on what you think league-wide about the changes to the upcoming schedule.
Yeah, I never really understood why Georgia was willing to cooperate with Auburn on that, because that was really Auburn trying to avoid, what it calls amen corner. And then look what happens. The SEC puts LSU right before the Alabama game for Auburn. So go figure. It didn't really work out that well for the Tigers this year. But and maybe that was a concession of some kind. I don't know. That you have to do that 1 year in order to get Georgia away from that spot on an annual basis.
Well, not to cut you off, but the one thing I think you and I both would agree on is the SEC is sensitive to the perception right now of what used to be that Cupcake Saturday, the week before all the big games. Georgia's playing Texas A&M in that spot this year. I guess it'll be Auburn, LSU, and Alabama playing somebody for 2020. So, whether it's related to this thing or not, I do think the SEC is looking to get rid of that November Saturday where nobody plays anybody, and I'm guessing the TV partners probably strongly suggested, hey, can we get some better games for that weekend?
No doubt, no doubt. And Cupcake Saturday won't be completely gone in 2020, but because some of those contracts are, you can't break them. But yeah, I mean, I think the SEC East specifically, because those four teams play out of conference games to finish the season, the SEC and usually have cupcake games right before. You're basically conceding the entire division down the stretch if you're the SEC, and creating a situation where there really isn't a whole lot of quality programming available. And so you do see more SEC East games late in the year in 2020. And because let's be real, like what Georgia beat Kentucky to win the East on November 3rd, I believe it was. Alabama won the West that day too, but that's unusual from a West perspective, but not an East perspective. I mean, that's typically when the division gets wrapped up anyway. So, I mean, I don't know this, for certain, even though I do work for one of the SEC's TV partners, but I would imagine the SEC is like, all right, look, we're not going to put a Kentucky-Mississippi State game or an Ole Miss Vandy game on the second to last week of the season just because it's out there and it's the only conference game. Come on. So, yeah, I mean, I think that if it was up to me, and I've said this for a long time, if it was up to me, I would make that former Cupcake weekend, Cupcake Saturday before rivalry weekend, I would make a rule that it's only conference games across the board. You cannot have a contract with any other team on that weekend because that's going to be an SEC weekend. I think they're sort of moving toward that, but since a lot of those contracts were already in place, it's sort of impossible, right? It's one of those things that's going to be a slow developing new trend that hopefully evolves into an actual policy.
Well, Barrett, it's always so much fun to talk about college football, whether it be looking ahead for a full year, which I never mind doing, or the season that's about to start. We appreciate your perspective, and not only because you picked the Dogs to win it all, we think that you have a great voice around this sport. So we'll look forward to reading a bunch more from you at cbssports.com and on Twitter at Barrett Sallee, and also checking you out on some streaming video stuff here and there as well, right?
That's right. CBS Sports HQ streaming 24/7, 365 on any device, smart TV, Apple TV, Roku, all that stuff, phone, iPad, you name it. It's what ESPN News used to be until they stopped covering news. So it's a good time.
Well, Barrett, it's great to have you on our program. We certainly appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, BA. Chop on.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, there's a little Braves reference from Barrett there at the end. I always love to hear that. So what Barrett said there about, the change of the schedule and how it impacts the SEC East, I think that's really interesting, and I think that's actually a really smart point. And admittedly, even though I'm critical of the move, this is something that Kirby Smart has also, I guess, somewhat, slightly referenced in the past. I was going to play this a little earlier, and I just ran short on time before we brought Barrett on the program. Can I go back and hear Kirby Smart on what he thought about why maybe this schedule change was going to be a good thing? Also kind of slightly referencing something that Barrett just brought up. Here's Kirby Smart.
That's not for me to decide. It's for the SEC office to decide. I think they do a great job working on that. It may bring more bigger factor to the end of the season because the games will be, divisional towards the end. But I think they do a great job of managing that, the SEC office, and they do it way out ahead of time.
So that's spring meetings in Destin. That's why you hear like the cello playing in the background. I believe that's the elevator type music you hear in a lot of these hotels. That's why you hear that underneath Kirby Smart right there. And it would not surprise me at all if the Auburn-Georgia change ended up being part of a larger change for the conference. As I said to Barrett a moment ago, I think that some people conflate two different issues. The move of putting Auburn LSU right before the Iron Bowl and having Alabama playing a SEC opponent that week as well is about, I think, a criticism from the TV partners about how weak that Saturday had been, and frankly also a little bit of a sensitivity about the perception of what we think of as the sports crucial month and the SEC essentially taking a week off. The enhanced SEC East race, given the fact that so many teams have in-state rivals who are not conference foes, is probably a byproduct there as well. But to remind you of what my point has been on this all along, Georgia has dominated the Auburn rivalry. If I was in charge and in control, if I had influence over this decision, my suggestion would be do not willingly cooperate with a change to a series you've dominated. Now, you may come back and say, well, moving into October, BA is not going to change any of that. You might be right. But I am still, if I'm in charge, not going to cooperate with a series that I've dominated because I don't get enough of value in return. Even if it benefits the SEC financially and it makes the TV partners happy, and by the way, CBS is about to pony up some big money, I think, for a new contract there. That could have been a factor in all this too. Even if it benefits the league financially, if it doesn't benefit me individually, I am not going to willingly cooperate because I have dominated the Auburn series going back now more than a decade. And you may come back then and say, well, BA, if that be the case, the SEC is still going to change it if that's what they want to do. They don't need Georgia's cooperation to make that change. That might be the case. But are you familiar with the concept of working the refs? Are you familiar with the concept of sometimes you flip out over a bad call as a way of reminding the refs you got a bad call, so maybe you get something later on? And I don't know what that something would be, but everything in life is a negotiation, and this is a negotiation as well. Georgia was cooperative with the back-to-back home games when the league went from 12 teams to 14 teams, and complaining about this, sometimes the squeaky wheel really does get the oil and really does get the fixing. Ultimately, it's probably not that big of a deal, and within a few years, we'll all just sort of be used to this the way that it is. But I think there was a different way for Georgia to handle this. It's obviously potentially a short-sighted opinion on my part because I'm not the guy with the suit and tie on making these tough decisions. But I believe the kind of change that Georgia sees coming to the Deep South's oldest rivalry is the kind of change I would have made them force me to make, not the kind of change I would have willingly made on my own. But we'll obviously have a long time to talk about this subject.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So as we transition to our SEC through here, first of all, huge thanks to Barrett Sallee for being a part of our program. Check him out at cbssports.com. Always a fun conversation. So I'm going to Georgia practice later on today, and, I was not there on Tuesday. I was warned about how hot it was. Heat index, probably 100 or so. We were outside yesterday at East Lake Golf Club. Got a lot of sunshine on top of the head, and so I said, let me make sure I pack a hat to take with me so I don't get too sunburned on my head. And the one hat that I grabbed to put on was my Callaway Resort and Gardens hat that I bought from the pro shop there after playing that lovely, and I don't use the word lovely lightly, golf course there. We played the Mountain View course, and it was so much fun. It's part of the amenities that make Callaway Resort and Gardens just a great summer getaway, but also a great getaway as we kind of head towards the fall. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place. We stayed there. My son, believe it or not, last night, this is a true story, said, Daddy, can I have my birthday party at Callaway Resort and Gardens? That's how much my family liked it. So if it's a couple thing, you want to do that, it makes all the sense in the world. The beach is still open, by the way. The lakeside stuff still open right now. If you want to do a couples thing, you can do that. But I can say from a family man's perspective, that's a great place to take family as well. So make sure if you get a chance, go to Callaway Resort and Gardens. It's CallawayGardens.com. And as Barrett said, we've got a long season coming up. For Georgia, that includes 2 bye weeks. Don't let me tell you how to live your life, but going and checking out Callaway Resort and Gardens for one of those bye weeks, for me, that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's talk about a few things here for a moment. There was a weird exchange at Florida this week, and for a second, I'm not going to be a Gator hater. I'm going to try to be somewhat objective about this. So Matt Baker, Tampa Bay Times, some pretty harsh coverage, although potentially fair coverage, of Dan Mullen over what is now a fifth accusation of kind of domestic violence against a Florida player since Dan Mullen's been coached. This involving a player allegedly choking someone who was tutoring him because she took his phone away. Mullen's response to this is pretty terse, saying that this is all being handled internally and kind of questioning of these instances, how many of those led to criminal charges. This has the look to some people of being Mullen maybe not taking these accusations seriously enough. My feelings on this are complicated. I think due process is the kind of thing that a lot of sports writers over time have shown they have no concept of and simply don't understand what is a constitutional right. So I think of that in instances like this, but I also think about, from Mullen's perspective here, what kind of looks like an unforced PR error, where we obviously know that lots of domestic issues don't lead to criminal charges because oftentimes the subject on the other end of that abuse doesn't want to go down that road for a number of reasons. I think Mullen, with his words, got this wrong. Obviously, none of us know what has happened with some of these Florida players, but Mullen, with his words here, has gotten this one wrong. He comes across as insensitive, and frankly, I think this is only going to cause more problems for him on down the line, but we'll follow it and see where it goes. Weird situation at Tennessee where they've had more attrition from their roster. Emmett Gooden, pretty good-looking defensive lineman, he suffers an injury. He is now going to be out. And also an offensive lineman who started a good number of games a year ago, Nathan Niehaus, he's decided to voluntarily leave the program, and Pruitt made it very clear this was a voluntary departure. We know how many, on the offensive line especially, how many medical disqualifications Tennessee has had. So for Jeremy Pruitt trying to build up his roster, there's always going to be a natural level of attrition that comes along with that, guys leaving the program. But either through injury or voluntary departures, Tennessee's had even a few more of those than you might think. So that continues. A couple other stories to mention to you here as well. Did you see Dabo Swinney in a little bit of a war of words continuing with Alabama? We know what the Alabama players have said about Clemson, that Georgia was their toughest game. That was taken as a swipe about Clemson. I had a Clemson player come back and say, well, Notre Dame was our toughest game. There's been all the talk about the Clemson schedule, and Dabo Swinney essentially said that Alabama, by virtue of the number of points it won its games by a year ago, ought to have been more rested by playing the SEC schedule than Clemson was by having played an ACC schedule that the SEC, in Dabo's mind, is essentially top-heavy. Listen, Dabo's winning argument is to say that he's got a top-flight team. His losing argument, and the thing that makes him look like a fool, is to argue the merits for the ACC. More than one thing can be true at one time. You can have an elite team. Clemson does. An elite team can be can be aided by an easy schedule. That's the situation there. We'll make that your SEC through, and let's check out John Stinchcomb with Own the East right now.
Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams, and certainly Georgia fans are looking forward to 2019 maybe being a year in which the Dogs win the national championship. Well, step one towards that is winning the division once again. With that in mind, I'm proud to be with former Georgia All-American John Stinchcomb, and for the third consecutive year, proud to do Own the East, presented by Georgia's own credit union. And John, as Georgia tries to own the East here in 2019, and maybe a whole lot more beyond that, there is a question that comes to mind. What happens if Jake Fromm gets hurt? Is Georgia in a dangerous situation if it were to lose its starting quarterback, given that on paper there is seemingly less depth at that position there has been the last couple of years for the Dogs?
Well, no team wants to lose their marquee quarterback that is a stud. I mean, he's in the national discussion for the Heisman Trophy and one of the top quarterbacks that could possibly come out early and enter the NFL draft. Nobody wants to lose that guy, and Georgia is no exception. Now, for some of the programs, well, unless you're Alabama in the second half of a game. I mean, heck, they love to bring in their second quarterback, don't they?
Seems to.
Yep, or Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, that's worked out well for them. I don't know if Georgia's in that boat, but the good news is you've surrounded the quarterback position with incredible talent.
Yeah.
I mean, Georgia is deep across the board, and they're able to take some of the pressure off the quarterback. Now, you don't want to see Jake go down, but Stetson, folks are excited about him and the security blanket that he provides.
Yeah,
do you want to see him? No.
Right, I think you're right about that. I think Stetson Bennett is a fan favorite. Obviously, this conversation is complicated more because of the fact that Dwan Mathis' status is still somewhat uncertain given the surgery that he's had to go through during the offseason, and yet we think that Bennett probably has a little bit of a leadership quality. We think that he certainly performed well in Georgia practice before. Georgia players themselves have told us that. So on a short-term basis, Bennett seems to generate enough confidence that people seem to think that if he's got the ball in his hand a little bit, it might not be the worst thing for the Dogs.
There's familiarity with the program. He left and had success when he did. And, when you lose your marquee guy, not a situation you like to discuss often, but when it happens, you want to feel safe. Mm-hmm. You want to feel like we're not putting too much on this replacement. Part of football is next man up. You have to have someone ready to step into those shoes and not have a huge drop off. And Stetson seems to be that guy that could step in and manage a game, and there's confidence from the rest of the team in that.
The other thing is, you mentioned Jalen Hurts earlier. He's not at Alabama anymore. And for the most part, in this age of the transfer portal, no national championship contender has that kind of quality backup quarterback. Georgia certainly doesn't have the 5-star waiting in the wings the way that it seemingly has the last couple of years. So while Georgia is maybe less deep than it used to be at quarterback, so are the other national championship contenders as well.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, I think that's the nature of the beast and how it's become a different game. If you're a 5-star quarterback, you're not waiting your turn anymore. You're trying to jump in from day one and be the guy. So Georgia's situation is not unique in that there's not 2 or 3 deep that you'd feel like could win a national championship off the bus doors when they open. So not unique, but not ideal either.
So certainly depth is a big part of the story. Anytime you're trying to own the East, quarterback's no different. And Jake Fromm, the rest of the Georgia quarterbacks, will get a lot of attention here in 2019. Own the East is brought to you by Georgia's Own Credit Union. Go to georgiasown.org. Find out how you can earn 1.25 points for every dollar earned on your Georgia's Own Visa Signature credit card. Also find out there how Georgia's Own Credit Union is celebrating 85 years in business. The website to go to, once again, georgiasown.org.
All right, really good stuff. Boy, I tell you what, you want to talk about doing something fun. John Stinchcomb is part of our Own the East, presented by Georgia's Own Credit Union today, this time. That has been his insight and his expertise on Georgia football has been a ton of fun. I'm looking forward to the rest of this series. I've got one dropping on the site today involving Georgia running back Zamir White that I'm really eager to share with you. So we'll do that on DawgNation.com. And, of course, make this part of what you get a chance to see on DawgNation Daily here as well. One more story I was going to get to. Speaking of Florida, did you see where Chris Steele transferred to USC, was granted immediate eligibility? I have no idea how the NCAA decides any of this kind of stuff. Fields, Martell get it. Luke Ford doesn't. Chris Steele does. Are they just drawing this stuff out of a hat? For the life of me, I don't get this. One thing I do get is our Gatorade updater. How about 1,013 days? That's how long it's been since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten Georgia. We'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily. And on video. Good to have you with us as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down, where we'll take as many of your comments as we can. Some of y'all say I've gotten to where I talk too softly on the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. I think this is kind of my cool down time, so I'll try not to do that. But I will remind you that R.S. Andrews is the source you want to turn to anytime you have air conditioning issue. I mentioned how hot it's been, or you get a water heater on the blink, anything like that. The well-trained and well-groomed techs from R.S. Andrews going to show up at your house on time, do the work that was promised for the price it was promised. No bad surprises with them. You can find them online by checking out rsandrews.com. All right, let's start on YouTube today, and we'll get as many comments as we can, assuming the people on YouTube are participating in the conversation here today. Let's see what's going on here. Let me see if I can find something. Dog Life says, no fighting on here today. Well, that's certainly good to hear. Appreciate that. Galvin family says, who starts opposite of Tyler Simmons? They're going to pencil in Simmons as a starter. Is it Cager or Pickens? The one thing to keep in mind with Georgia when it comes to its wide receivers, and if you've got any old Georgia games saved on your DVR, you can go back and watch this. watch Georgia offensively and watch how often it changes receivers. Oftentimes, they'll do wholesale changes every play. You'll see 2 guys come off, 3 guys go on. So anytime you talk starters at wide receiver for Georgia, you have to use that phrase loosely. If you go back to 2017, Georgia essentially had 2 different kinds of receivers. The kinds of receivers it wanted to throw to and the kinds of receivers that it used for blocking. Trey Blunt, for instance, was on the field a lot in 2017 because he was a physical blocker. Jason Stanley was kind of in that role a bit as well. Stanley's athletic, but they used him mostly as a blocker. Then they had other guys they would put in the game when they wanted to throw the ball. I think as Kirby Smart's offensive philosophy evolves, or as his control over the UGA roster evolves, I think now you see that the physical guys who can block are also the guys that you don't mind throwing the football to, and a guy like Blunt may prove to be one of those as well. But you don't necessarily need to change guys out for the kind of play you want to run anymore. But I don't believe that's going to stop Georgia from making wholesale changes on a regular basis. I think Kirby Smart understands one thing. The team morale matters. Getting guys involved in the action is a way to improve team morale, and that's just going to save you some trouble on down the line. So in terms of starters, it's probably more appropriate to think about the top 6. When Georgia typically has 3 receivers on the field, it'll be probably 2 different sets of 3. From that group, I think about D-Rob and potentially Blaylock in the interior as the slot receiver, with Kearis Jackson knocking on that door. On the outside, you mentioned Simmons. I think that's a worthy name. I'll add Pickens to that. I'll add Cager to that. And then from that, there's room for one more of those. Is it a Landers? Is it a Tommy Bush? Is it Blunt that I mentioned before? But that's essentially where we are. I think when you think about starters for Georgia, you've got to think about the 6 guys who play the most often, and in groups of 3, they'll pretty much split all those reps. Brian McPhail says, I want to see Georgia overwhelm Vanderbilt in the first game and limit their running game. Yeah, Brian, I think that's a great thing to watch for in terms of how Georgia performs against the spread. For instance, Georgia's probably somewhere between a 17 and a 20-point favorite on the road at Vanderbilt, if I had to guess. And while that'll be an interesting metric to compare Georgia to, against the Vanderbilt running game, which has gotten a lot of attention this offseason, pretty good-looking situation for the Commodores there. Georgia not great a year ago at stopping the run. If you can go on the road in the SEC and limit that running game, that'll be a big signal to someone like me about why this might be a better year than not for Georgia. If this is one of those deals where Georgia wins 35-14, 35-17, but Vandy still averages 5.5 yards a carry, or has a success rate somewhere in the ballpark of 40 or 50%, that's not going to be something I'm going to like quite as much. I'm going to be looking a little closer than the final score for that game against the Commodores, and the run defense in particular may be the thing I'm looking at the closest. Shane Bentley checking out of the program today. Shane, appreciate you being here with us. Enrique Murillo says everyone's doubting Trey Hill in the offensive line. Do you think he's our weakest spot, BA? Not saying our offensive line has any weaknesses. Hill had some issues last season at center, so a lot to unpack there. I don't know that I would say that Hill had issues. I think that Kirby Smart, in the one game that Hill mostly played at center against Kentucky, Kirby Smart gave him a lot of compliments. That was a good Kentucky defense. Don't forget that. And I think that Smart was pretty happy with the way that Hill played. Once Lamont Gilliard left that game with an injury, Hill was the starter at right guard for the final 4 games of the year. After Ben Cleveland got hurt, I won't pretend to tell you what Hill graded out at in that spot, but I certainly don't have any indication that he graded poorly as a right guard in those moments. If it is true that Trey Hill is your weakest link, then that is one heck of a compliment about not just the Georgia offensive line, but maybe the Georgia program overall. Georgia has actually become a bit of a strong program when it comes to centers. You think about like RBU, and some people talk about DBU and maybe wide receiver U. Go back and look at the heritage for Georgia at centers. Gilliard was a very good center. Ben Jones, Boss Andrews, guys like that. Georgia's had a nice little run of centers here, and I get the impression that Hill is really the next one of those. And it's kind of cool because there are obviously a lot of guys in this Georgia roster who could potentially play that position. at one point in time, Salyer was thought to be a center, and now, even as a primary backup, I think he's more suited for like a right tackle or either of the two guard spots. Obviously, Clay Webb comes in as a center. It sounds like he's getting a good bit of work at that position right now, to say nothing of Warren Erickson. But Hill, who at one point in time people wondered if he might be a guard as well, no, I'm assuming he's a rock-solid center. And this was a big recruiting win for Georgia to get him the year after it had recruited the rest of the offensive line as well as it did, going head-to-head and beating out Auburn for him. Now, being a teammate of Jake Fromm probably helped there, but that was a really good win. Green Soldier says, BA, what game do you expect to see our young players begin to make a name for themselves by Notre Dame sooner or later? Green, from an entertainment standpoint, I hope you see a good bit of this along the way. I hope that we see a flash of a freshman against Vanderbilt and those, two cupcakes that follow that in September, just because it gives us something to talk about. It'll be kind of a fun thing to see. I've said before, especially when you think about the Blaylocks and the Pickenses, Georgia probably doesn't really need those guys to be at their best until later on in the year. Certainly December, January, that's a big deal, but I'd also add to that when Georgia goes on the road at Tennessee. Tennessee's got a better secondary than Notre Dame does. So while Notre Dame's going to get the national attention, some of the defensive issues that Tennessee can provide, even after Gooden's injury, that's still, a little bit of a tougher spot in Neyland. Crowd probably still involved in the season, involved in that game. So that's the day when you hope that what Georgia learned against Notre Dame, what it has learned against 3 other opponents in the month of September, you hope you can take that with you to Knoxville and Neyland Stadium at that point in time, because that's when you need those guys to start showing some growth, showing some maturity. There may be a little bit of a degree of growing pains with that. And then I'd also add to that early November when you play Florida, who I'll be as critical of Florida as anybody. I'm not going to knock the secondary all that much, though. There's a good bit of talent there. By that point in time, you hope some of these young guys, especially in the receiving corps, have gotten enough experience that late in the year, they're ready to do battle with that group and neutralize what could be a strength for Florida. Let me pop over here on Facebook, because I've been on YouTube now for quite a while. AC Slater mentioning DJ Daniel. And Daniel's one of these guys I think is really interesting to pay attention to as well, for the reason we always seem to cite when we bring up Daniel. And by the way, Jeff's got a good piece on Daniel. That's his Georgia's own homegrown. That's his Georgia's homegrown talent piece, I think, for this week is on DJ Daniel. You can check that out with our friends at the Georgia Farm Bureau. But Daniel's a junior college transfer, right? I mean, Georgia typically wouldn't look to take a defensive back in that regard unless they thought he could play. Daniel certainly can, and he's another one of these guys that can really run. We talked about a fast secondary off the top of our program today. That's an example of that for sure. Matt Rukavina says, BA, do you think Kirby's going to be more patient with Coley's play calling, or will it be a headset monster day one? That's kind of funny. That image of Kirby shouting into that headset. That was certainly a scene there after the Kentucky game. And I'm guessing that Kirby Smart is going to have a good degree of patience, because my guess is that he has a good idea of what Coley's going to do. This isn't Nick Saban outsourcing his offense to Lane Kiffin in 2014. Eventually, Kirby Smart may need to do that, but right now, this is not what this is. This is Kirby Smart trading out one guy that was instilling his vision for another guy who's going to attempt to instill his vision. The one place that you hope some of that creativity does show up, though, is down near the goal line, where Georgia had its problems a year ago, and those headset monster moments seem to kind of come around the goal line situation. But this is not an outsourced offense for Georgia right now. This is, I believe, Coley doing what Kirby Smart has as the vision for his offense, and that's my guess what we're going to see. Not a lot of impatience from Smart because of the fact that Coley's simply doing what he wants him to do. If it doesn't work, it's on Kirby, in other words. Matt Talley bringing up Notori Johnson, still working with the defensive line. Haven't heard much about him there. Yeah, I haven't heard about that either. I do think he's slimmed down a little bit based on some of the photos and videos that I saw of him going back to the summer. So I think he's in pretty good physical condition. But I've told you, and I hate to be this way, that's just a really hard transition. I think the defensive line is inherently more of an athletic position than the offensive line is. Now, what Jordan Davis does is a little bit more about being just a big space-eating mauler, but we see the transition from defensive line to offensive line made more successfully than we see the reverse, offensive lineman going to defensive line. So it was always going to be a tough transition for Notori Johnson. He deserves some credit for being willing to give it a try, and be as much of a gamer about it as he's apparently chosen to be, I'll give him a ton of credit for that. But on a group that already has a lot of bodies, if still a bit unproven, and frankly, leaving something to be desired with the total results for the group, there are a lot of names over there, a lot of bodies over there. This is going to be a tough competition, and to his credit, he seems to be battling there, but it certainly seems like he's not all that close to maybe making an impact with playing time, at least based on the best guess I can make. Matt Tower was talking about stealing somebody's comment, Thunder. I apologize if somebody's comment didn't get read. Alan Beck says, how big of a role will Hot Rod play in the offense this year? Will it be a bigger role than last year? So I love Hot Rod. Everybody does. I'm also of the belief, though, that national champions don't necessarily have the best kicker. They're the teams that use their kicker the least. And so in terms of Hot Rod having a role in the offense, I'd love to see him get a chance to throw a 2-point conversion or a touchdown against Auburn this year to keep that little tradition alive against Gus Malzahn. But the one thing that you hope, with respect to Rodrigo, the one thing you hope is that Georgia game plans away from field goals. It's going to take touchdowns. If you're playing Alabama in the SEC championship, you got to score touchdowns. If you're playing a Clemson in the college football playoff, you got to score touchdowns. So, Rodrigo is going to be there when Georgia needs the field goal, but settling for a field goal is a way to settle for something less than the college football playoff.
I like Rodrigo as much as anybody, but we need to see a lot less of Rodrigo Blankenship this year.
Yeah.
Unless it's on kickoffs, where he might be better on kickoffs than he is at field goals.
And that's a weapon. Average starting field position is one of the real predictive stats in college football. So in that sense, you're aiding the defense as much as you're aiding the offense. But it's about touchdowns. It's why when I think about the red zone, I kind of follow the lead of some of the stat guys who tell you that the real red zone is not 20 and in. The real red zone is 40 and in. Those are your scoring opportunities, and what you do once you cross your opponent's 40 really determines the success of your offense. And so once you get into the 30-whatever yard line, turning one of those into a touchdown as opposed to settling for a field goal is a big way to get those extra points, and that really matters. Justin Dowell says that he wants to see Kirby Smart go for it on fourth down more this season. If ever in a go for it on fourth down situation, I would agree with you on that. I think one of the strategic, I don't want to say weaknesses, but strategic areas in which I would love to see something different from Smart, especially based on his first 3 years in the job, is that willingness to go for it on fourth down a little bit more. I think the better team in a situation ought to press the issue, right? If you're the better team, basketball, you want to play faster. Football, you want to be more aggressive because you feel like you've got the talent to bail you out. So I believe Georgia, as much as any team, ought to be a fourth down team. The weird thing, sometimes in college football, it's the underdog type teams end up going for it on fourth down a little bit more. That's because they have coaches who are willing to gamble and take risks. As much as it pains me to say this, I'll give Paul Johnson credit for that. Johnson was going for it on fourth down years ago before some of the math caught up about just how smart typically going for it on fourth down is. Anybody who's ever played Madden understands that. So Johnson was kind of ahead of the curve on that. We haven't seen some of the top teams in college football be quite as aggressive on fourth down, but if you really pay attention to the percentages and the numbers, those are the teams that ought to be going for it on fourth down the most. I'd put Georgia in that group. Santiago D. Arn says, love your thoughts if Cade May is going to play fullback on short distances in the red zone again. I loved it last year, would love to see him back there again. So somebody's going to be number 40-something. Is it Mays? Maybe not, because he would be offensive lineman number 6 or number 7 right now. If I'm doing the math in my head, you may want to keep him wearing his traditional offensive line number. But somebody from that offensive line core, we've seen it be Justin Schaefer before. Could it be a guy like Cade Mays this year? Because Mays is maybe a little more athletic than you might think, not quite as big as you might think either. He might fit into that H-back role a little bit better than some of those guys do. But somebody from that offensive line group is going to be number 42 at some point in time. That's just kind of what Georgia does, chooses to do. I don't know how often, though, you're going to see, and I'm a two-back set fan. I like the idea of two backs, two tight ends, make them think it's power and then throw it. I love that set. I think the NFL teams that do that are really smart and really creative. Down near the goal line, though, I think that Georgia may look to go a different direction this year than just mauling people inside the 10, because that strategy did not work last year. Steve Highland says fake punts are okay as long as Fields not running the fake. He was off schedule big time. Yeah, that was a disastrous blunder play. And we think about Georgia going for it on fourth down. Hopefully we think about something a little bit more straightforward than a fake play that was doomed to fail. AC Slater also bringing up Bill Norton. I think that Norton becomes a more interesting name on this Georgia roster now that Brenton Cox is not here. We think of Cox as an outside linebacker, but if you also think about him as a traditional 3-4 defensive end for a moment, his absence opens the door for Norton a bit more. Gregory Nelson says, he says, let me try to get Gregory's comment. Every time I try to do this, it never works, but let me see if I can scroll back up here and get this. He says, traditionally, we haven't seen a receiver as one of the positions where freshmen can step in and be game ready, more so than others. Calvin Ridley, Justin Ross, A.J. Green, etc. Yeah, so lately there has been a lot more of a push for receivers playing well. It used to be that it was rare to find receivers in college who oftentimes stepped up and had big years. We've had more of that lately. I think one of the things that can be forgotten, though, is in an instance when a receiver steps up and has a big year, sometimes we forget that every yard counts and every yard matters, and that even in moments like where Clemson has Justin Ross a year ago, you've still got a totality of receiving yards that are largely contributed to by experienced players. So there is nothing that says your best receiver can't be a freshman. Lots of teams have had a freshman be its best receiver. But when the entirety of your receiving yards are made up of guys that didn't have experience the year before, that's a little bit more of a rarity, and it's just worth pointing out. Something having not happened before doesn't make it an impossibility, but if Georgia this year produces an elite national championship level amount of receiving yards, which is way more than Georgia's had thus far under Kirby Smart, the fact that Georgia will do that with almost an entire crop of receivers that didn't have big productivity a year ago, or in most cases had no productivity, either because they weren't on the roster or still in high school, that'll be Georgia kind of carving a path unique for itself that we just haven't seen from other folks. Dante Green talking about Chaney in the red zone. That's the one area where I will most likely agree with the Chaney critics that he should have done better. Way too conservative in there. As we've said a million times in this space as a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down, once you take the fight and put it into a phone booth, which is what you from 10-yard line and in, you're essentially in a phone booth. You've only got 100 square yards to work with. That's all you've got. 20. Am I doing the math? Did I do the math? Yeah, 20 by 50. You've got about 100 square yards to work with. That's essentially having a fist fight in a phone booth. You are not going to maul people in that area. You've got to have a little bit of elusiveness to your play calling, a little bit of misdirection to your play calling. Georgia did not have enough of that. Did not have enough of that at all. Robbie McCullough says, how about an I formation with McBride at fullback? So the funny thing about McBride is he's actually probably more of a runner than a thumper. I mean, not to say that he can't lay the lumber, but the thing that McBride has that makes him an elite SEC prospect, the thing that made him a 4-star linebacker coming out of Idalia, was his speed. And so if you ever played McBride at a different position, I think you'd want to try to find something that utilizes speed with more so than a fullback situation. Let me read this from Jonathan Harding, who says that his niece, Kaitlyn Smart, watched our show every day. She passed away from cancer on G-Day. Jake Fromm is wearing her bracelet this year. It's purple, says play with a purpose for Kaitlyn. This year the dogs will all play with a purpose. Boy, that's an incredibly nice thing to hear, Jonathan, about Fromm's support of her, and I am so sorry for your loss, and so sorry. Obviously, Kaitlyn is a story that we've seen some about on social media. We appreciate you checking in, and obviously it means the world to me to know that she was watching our show, and I know her legacy lives on, and words fail me to probably put into context, what it must have been like for your family. But I know how proud you'll be to see, Fromm and other Georgia players remembering her in a way that certainly befits her legacy. So our prayers to you and your family, and the fact that you would weigh in and tell us that about our show just really means a lot to me, Jonathan. So thank you so much for checking in and being a part of what we're doing. And as I said before, so sorry for your loss, and so proud to see Georgia playing in her honor this season. By the way, somebody mentions Caleb Williams. So come to find out, as Jeff Sintel said, the Caleb Williams tweet from yesterday was probably more about him starting the season than making any kind of announcement. So maybe we got drawn off sides on that one a little bit. Alton McGurk says this. He says we'll have Fromm next year and signing Caleb Williams. He'll be the next star quarterback. So obviously there's already some excitement about the 2021 signal caller and his possible connection to UGA. And I will say that, as recently as a couple of months ago, I probably wasn't all that ready to talk about 2021 quarterbacks. It just wasn't really all that on my mind. But I have learned enough about Williams to say that I am definitely ready to talk about them now. And he is definitely a very interesting name whenever he does decide to make his move. Alton McGurk says he's a bad dude. Yeah, whenever he does decide to make his move, you better believe we'll be paying very close attention to that. And one of the fun things is, being a part of one of these major programs there in the Beltway area, he obviously, gets a lot of attention. Going to be playing a pretty good schedule. Jeff said he's playing St. Thomas Aquinas to open his season. That's the August 30th date that Caleb referenced on Twitter yesterday. And, there are going to be some other good teams on that schedule. So he's going to have a lot of experience in his high school career. I think sometimes the lack of experience can be a problem for some elite quarterbacking prospects. He's not going to have that, barring injury, and we can't control that. He's going to have a good bit of experience, and he's going to play a tough schedule. We don't always think of that sort of Beltway area is necessarily being a high school football hotbed, but that's certainly starting to change as the populations shift. So he's going to be well groomed by the time he gets ready to go to college, and obviously a lot of Georgia fans are hopeful that he goes to UGA, as it looks like Connor Riley's ready to join us. Well, by the way, before I let you go, David Gross also mentions the possibility of Xavier Truss at fullback. You'll talk about a big monster lining up that fullback position. Xavier doing that would be quite a load to deal with. And I apologize for cutting you off.
Back to Caleb Williams for a minute. The last dual threat quarterback, or true highly ranked dual threat quarterback that Georgia recruited, he did not have a lot of experience coming out of that high school rank. He did not play a lot. His senior season was cut short, and I do think that sort of inexperience showed itself a little bit in his freshman year at Georgia. And Williams is a guy, he's going to have played his entire career at one of the most talent-rich areas in the country. I know a little bit about high school football in that area. He's playing against DeMatha Catholic, St. John's. He's playing against really, really good teams in that D.C. area, and he's playing legit competition. Guys like, Mikhail Sherman, he'll play. If Sherman is able to get cleared this year, he'll play that team. If he'll line up against Marshawn Lloyd. So he's going to see real competition, real guys who are going to play at the next level. And I think that's sort of what makes him a really intriguing quarterback prospect, maybe even more so than Brock Vandergriff, because Vandergriff, while he is a Prince Avenue Christian, they're just not playing a whole lot of, elite D1 athletes down there. So, having that kind of experience with Williams, I think, could really help him a lot early on in his time at Georgia.
So over here on YouTube, they're talking about the upcoming 2020 schedule and Georgia going to Alabama and who the two quarterbacks are going to be for the teams when that game takes place, which I think is an interesting conversation. Let me give you a hot take that nobody asked for. I don't know.
Does anybody ever ask for hot takes?
I don't know that anyone's just begging for them. I don't know who the starting quarterback for either of those two teams will be that day, but I do believe this. Georgia will be a point spread favorite in Tuscaloosa.
Well, Georgia was the last team to be a point spread favorite against Alabama, and we all know how.
And that game did not go well. Admittedly. So it's not necessarily a great sign of Georgia's a favorite, but just given the fact that playing in Tuscaloosa, I don't believe Bama's lost there since 2015. Am I right about that?
The Ole Miss game.
Yeah, lost to Ole Miss in 2015. So it'd be a pretty big statement about UGA were they to be a point spread favorite in that game. They were about a touchdown underdog on a neutral field this past December, and that's about where Vegas would have an early look.
I believe they were a 2-touchdown underdog against Alabama.
Was it that much?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe it was something around 13 points.
Did not remember it being that high, but that's, in other words, that's how much of a sea change I believe you're going to see by the time this game is played next September. I believe Georgia's the favorite there. And obviously that likely means that Georgia will get a win versus Alabama either in the SEC championship, which I have not predicted to happen, or possibly in the college football playoff, which Barrett Sallee on our show today predicted to happen. So think about this for a moment. Let's say I'm right about this. If Georgia were to beat Alabama this year, then play in Tuscaloosa next year and beat Alabama again, I think that's essentially Kirby Smart ending the Nick Saban era.
I mean, that's how the narrative. Well, one, that's how the narrative flips. But two, I mean, I don't think it's a guarantee that we even see Saban in that Alabama game next year.
100% agree.
I would not be stunned at all if, let's say Alabama wins a national title this year and he decides to just hang it up with Tua, or, things go poorly for him at the end of this season and you're on record as saying they're not going to win the West. They might lose 2 or 3 games. If that's the case, he might just decide, and again, I'm not disparaging Saban in any way. I've said again and again, and this is mostly directed at G. Grace on YouTube, that he is the best coach ever to coach in college football. But, at a certain point, he's getting up there in age and, he just might not have anything to keep him going in the ticker. And, I could certainly understand if he just decides, I don't want to deal with the pressure and the things that come with this job year in, year out, where, winning 10 games winning 10 games, not winning a national title, is seen as a failure.
Yeah, I think that I've made it pretty clear. The first year that Alabama does not go to the college football playoff, that will be Saban's final year. I don't think he has the stomachs to stick around and deal with the high level of expectations that exist for Alabama fans. So if they fail to make the playoff this year, I do truly believe there'll be a different coach in Tuscaloosa facing Georgia next season. But there's obviously a lot that needs to happen before that can play out. Lawton Strickland on YouTube says, we'll be in the same position as Bama Fromm leaves. He talks about how Tua Tagovailoa will be leaving as well. He says, and we have just enough talent to give them a run for it in 2020. Yeah, I mean, I think that if Tua leaves this year, obviously he's likely to. If Fromm leaves after this season, there's a strong chance he would do that. I think that both Georgia and Alabama will be in the same boat. They'll be looking to supplement their quarterback competition with a veteran quarterback. I've told y'all before, I don't really know the name of who that would be, but I do believe it'll be. I believe that Georgia and Alabama, if they get into that market, will be looking for top-flight, established starters. Someone they can come in and really make for an interesting competition. If a Talia Tagovailoa or a Paul Tyson were to beat out that guy, all the better for Alabama. The same thing for Carson Beck or DeJuan Mathis or Stetson Bennett at Georgia. But I think that in the event that the 2 juniors leave, I think that Georgia and Alabama will be looking to supplement their quarterback competition with a veteran somehow. And as I cited the other day, we talked about Gardner Minshew. It doesn't have to be someone you've heard of to be someone that could potentially make a pretty big announcement. Dennis Wilson, one of our resident YouTube trolls, says, "BA, you can't wait until Saban leaves. Can hear it in your voice." Dennis, I'll admit this. Here's where I'm spiteful. This is what I can't wait for. Right now, you can find all kinds of Alabama fans, goobers on message boards, things like that, who will talk about how much of a bad coach they think that Kirby Smart is and how Kirby Smart cannot coach with, in a head-to-head matchup versus Nick Saban. There's no shortage of fans who feel that way. Watch this. If Kirby beats Saban this year in heading into what will either be a matchup without Saban in September or maybe a chance to get another win versus Saban, watch the evolution occur. And the same sort of shameful desperation of Alabama fans begging Dabo Swinney to come be their coach after Saban leaves. You're going to see some of that turn, and all of a sudden, some of these Bama fans who didn't think that Kirby Smart was quite good enough, you're going to see a little bit of a change then. I think it's going to be just as fruitless because there's no way Kirby Smart's going anywhere. But the big narrative among Alabama fans, especially the message board crowd, is going to be, well, we just want to get Kirby Smart going to be our coach. That's what it's going to be, once they sour on Saban, once he stops giving them a college football playoff every year. So that's the moment that I long for. That's the thing that I can't wait to see. See the Alabama fans, finally wave the white flag of surrender and take a if you can't beat him, join him mentality. There's a lot that needs to happen to get there, but I am entertained by that possibility. Entertained very much so by that possibility. William Lee says Bama fans do not want Kirby. The point is, that's what they say now. Let's watch things how things evolve. Now, either way, they're not getting him, but I think you're going to see a big-time evolution for Alabama fans as they come to the realization of what life post-Saban could be like. And G. Grace, who I do like, he's one of the few Bama people that we do enjoy around here. He says, we will be getting Kirby or Dabo for sure. So that gives you an idea what the Alabama fan thinks about a lot of this kind of stuff.
Wait, before we move on, where is it? Here it is. $100 that when Saban moves on, Kirby Smart nor Dabo Swinney is the next head coach.
Oh yeah, 100%. By the way, Groon D, I think, just outed himself as an Alabama fan. I didn't know if Groon was claiming any kind of official designation. He says, this is actually a pretty funny quote. He says, in the meantime, BA, we're going to keep enjoying your face after every loss. I have to admit that, Groon, that's not a bad comment. I probably deserve that. Double R says they'll probably make a run at Urban Meyer. I do think Meyer's name could be interesting here because, not for Alabama necessarily, although maybe not. Look at a situation like what's going to happen at Auburn, where Gus Malzahn could be on the hot seat. But the problem is, it seems to me that we have, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me we have less home run hire possibilities than we ever have had before. Normally, and y'all know, especially those of you who've been around for a long time, y'all know that I love the coaching carousel. I love the coaching rumor season, kind of post-championship games, heading towards the playoff, kind of early January stuff. I love the coaching rumor mill. Post-signing day in February, you get a lot of that kind of stuff. I love that kind of stuff. But now, let's say that Auburn fans soured on Malzahn, which very well might happen. Who is going to be the number one name that shows up on the message boards of I tell you what, this is the guy we ought to go out and get? Because a lot of the guys that used to be that have kind of proven themselves to be not worth the trouble. I mean, Chip Kelly pulled the wool over people's eyes for a long time in Philadelphia. And
come on.
Listen, I've heard some stories about him.
I'm sure you have. But Chip Kelly was also, what he did at Oregon is as good as what anyone has done elsewhere.
Somehow, some way, the rest of his coaching life has not quite lived up to that.
I mean, he still took the Eagles to the playoffs. And if you're going to put what happened in San Francisco on him, like that team, that was the worst, talent-wise, that was the worst team in the league.
I think what's happening at UCLA right now is an unmitigated disaster to the point of almost falling below any reasonable, acceptable standard. I think he's just proven himself not to be worth the trouble. John Gruden's the same way. Gruden for a long time was the Tennessee savior. Even if that was fiction, that was at least the name the message boards could point to. I think he's going to be just as bad with the Raiders on the second go-around as Chip Kelly's going to be at UCLA. So those are examples of some of the, the white knights that could have ridden in and been a savior in the past. Who are those guys now? I mean, who is the message board crowd going to gravitate towards at a place like Auburn? Meyer's essentially the only guy. I guess Stoops is out there as well. I think he does want to coach again. Otherwise, he wouldn't be, messing around with this spring league. So I think he probably wants to coach again. So maybe you add him into this list. It's a Stoops, it's a Meyer, and that's really about it, right?
Hugh Freeze.
Not bad.
They'd love him there.
Not bad.
I think they'd overlook what happened at Ole Miss. He won a lot at Ole Miss, and Ole Miss is never going to be as good as they were when Hugh Freeze was at Ole Miss. And he's more importantly shown that he's maybe the one coach in the country now, other than Dabo. Dabo's done it since, but he's the one coach in the country that can at least beat Saban, at least schematically with inferior players. So, I think that is something that would make him very appealing.
Ken Feinberg mentions Lane Kiffin here for a moment. This is also kind of part of my point. Like, you don't really hear Kiffin's name mentioned much anymore. I mean, it almost seems like his 15 minutes of fame might be about done. And now that Freeze is a head coach again, now that Liberty's taken that bullet, he's at least hireable again.
Now, see, some people are getting way out ahead of themselves. Like I've seen, Steven Salter throws out Del McGee, Ben Green throws out Dan Lanning. As far as McGee, I don't know if Auburn is going to have the stomach to make a position coach and a guy who's never been a head coach at the college level a full-time head coach. But, if Auburn were smart, they'd just write Dell a blank check to be their offensive coordinator and their director of recruiting. And he played at Auburn, and I think that'd be really smart. As far as Lanning, Alabama's not going to hire Dan Lanning, especially if he hasn't been a head coach before. But, I think maybe a program a few years down the line, if he gets a little more season and things go poorly for Matt Luke, Ole Miss is a place that might make a lot of sense for him with his connections to the Memphis area.
And I'll say something that I said yesterday, and after this we're going to get ready to wrap things up. I am not as into building new buildings as everybody else is. I'm not against it, but I don't think it's the recipe for success on the field that some people think it is. But you better believe that Georgia, the money that it is making, I think the most important thing for Georgia in the future is to keep spending that, to keep these guys in place as long as you possibly can. Del McGee leaving Georgia to be an offensive coordinator. That's money that you've got to spend to hope that doesn't happen and give him a pipeline to be a head coach some other way. Money to one day keep Dan Lanning. I think that's going to be an issue. At least it seems like a possibility. That's money that you hope Georgia spends. In the future, I think that's the money that really matters. It's not necessarily giving the coaches nice, shiny offices or making, some other part of the facility, way nicer. I even kind of feel that way about weight rooms a little bit, although I understand why you'd want to have a big one of those a whole lot more. But the money that you would spend to keep somebody from coming and poaching your talent, I think it's going to be really, really important in the future. Obviously, a program like Alabama hasn't been able to avoid that, but that's also because a lot of folks just don't like working with Saban. I don't get the impression that Kirby Smart wears out his welcome with his assistants quite the same way that Saban probably did. Final thought from you, Connor, on any subject?
I think this stuff is kind of cyclical, and I will be interested to see if, what kind of innovation comes from this. Do teams maybe try and go after, old NFL guys? USC did that with Pete Carroll, and it worked really well a few years ago. I'll be interested to see what Arizona State does with Herm Edwards there. I know that selection was widely panned when he first went there. But I think Edwards, he's a guy who relates well to young people, and he's done a lot of work with, Under Armour and those recruiting all-star games. So I'll be interested to see, if that becomes a trend and people sort of look for these guys who have some NFL success and can sort of, is that the route college teams try and go now?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I want to do one thing on the schedule before we go. Let me also mention Alan Beck, who says, do you think that Sanford Stadium will ever expand to 100,000? I really don't. I think that most college stadiums, if the administrators had their way, they'd make them all a little bit smaller. For the most part, Georgia has been immune to the real ticket shrinking, the shrinking of crowds. For the most part, Georgia's been relatively immune to that. The Georgia crowds are still pretty strong. You do see fewer visiting fans coming to Athens than you used to see. That may not be the case as much this year with A&M and Notre Dame, but in the past you've seen a lot fewer visiting fans. That's one of those 600 level tickets are now available for the most part for a lot of Georgia fans to buy. But all across college football, I think most ADs, most administrators would rather have a smaller stadium. The one thing that I think you will see more of at Georgia is you're going to see increased luxury seating. And you can kind of roll your eyes at that if you want to. But the one thing in sports there's always a demand for. There's always a demand for cheap tickets for the average fan. There's always a demand for like really nice luxury accommodations for the people who want to kind of show off their wealth and their status. So at some point in time, something's going to be done to enhance the luxury offerings at UGA. I think I have an idea of what that's eventually going to be. I don't necessarily want to say it out loud, but that's what you're going to see more of at Sanford Stadium at some point in time. They're going to do something to make the stadium nicer for the people that can afford that, but I don't think we ever see another ribbon of seats added to either of the two end zones, for instance. I just don't think there's enough of a ticket demand to do that anymore, but I do believe there's a pretty significant demand for additional luxury accommodations, and I do believe at some point Georgia's going to provide that.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, would you rather stay at home and watch the game on a 70-inch flat screen with your big couch and you sort of pick a food, or would you rather, wait in long lines for a hot dog, or in your case, a Polish sausage? And, they're going to have to find ways to make stadiums more appealing. And I think packing more people into that stadium isn't necessarily the right way to go about doing that.
I think eventually what Georgia's going to do is I think they're going to take the current press box. They're going to put that 10,000 miles into the sky and take the pretty substantial real estate that's currently given to the press box. It's actually a really good seat. It's a really good place to watch a game. It's almost too nice to last forever. I'm pretty sure at some point in time that's probably real estate that Georgia will use to take care of more of its elite donor class. Last thing on the schedule, I made my case on this before. We'll let people weigh in on this. Connor, you can weigh in on this too. I think it's interesting to go to Alabama in September. I think it's interesting to play a game on a Monday night. Not necessarily my favorite thing to do, but it's at least interesting. I was thinking back. I remember '85 Georgia playing Alabama on a Monday night, I believe. The night they retired Herschel Walker's jersey, a loss, unfortunately, in Athens. Obviously, the national championship game was a Monday a couple of years ago. That's kind of fun. I don't like cocktail party being on Halloween for young kids. That's not a great thing. I've made my case and said my piece about the Georgia-Auburn deal. What are your thoughts on the 2020 schedule, Connor, as it's released? And I'll invite you to also let me know what anybody else on our comment sections is saying about our schedule as well.
Despite having Alabama on there, I actually think it's an easier schedule, especially sort of with the way the dates are set up in that back half of the schedule. That the November stretch this year we've talked about a lot is really tough. The November stretch in 2020 is going to be really easy for Georgia.
I'm surprised that you say easy because, at South Carolina the week after Florida, I don't necessarily think of as an easy game. Now, everything for Georgia in the East has been easy as of late, but that's a pretty tough, if I've got the dates right, that's a pretty tough road spot to be the week after what is typically going to be a pretty emotional game against Florida. I guess I didn't think of the November schedule as quite as easy as you did, but I'm also not that, overwhelmed by it either.
South Carolina, we heard last year all about, and South Carolina opened with Georgia as their SEC opener, and we heard all about that game and how it's a buzz game and it might be a trap game and how South Carolina might be able to spring an upset. And Georgia is just so much, and will always be, just given what South Carolina is and is able to do and what Georgia is and able to do, just so much more talented than what Georgia is. And South Carolina is really trying to build, an inferior brand of what Georgia is trying to do, I think. And because of that, I don't think they're ever going to really, leap up and catch Georgia and surprise them with that.
And then obviously the real schedule to watch for is 2021 to see now Tennessee a road game for Georgia, in essentially the same spot the Auburn road game would have been. And let's see if they do continue to put a big SEC game for Alabama and Auburn the week before the Iron Bowl. Something tells me that may soften over the course of time. And by that point in time, no one's going to be paying attention and no one's going to have noticed because that's just the way the news cycle kind of works. Any comments, Connor, Facebook or YouTube from anybody on the subject of the schedule before we get out of here?
Let's see.
While you're looking for those, I'll remind folks to make sure you check out the AJC for Atlanta News Now. There's a really interesting story in the AJC today about Brian Banks, the former Falcon who was really wrongly accused and unjustly imprisoned. And there's a movie coming out about him now. He's got an amazing story. This is really something you're going to want to check out. It's a great job of reporting on the Bank story at AJC. And check in throughout the day to get your Atlanta News Now at AJC.com. That's Atlanta News Now. You can get yours at AJC.com. Connor, how about a final comment?
A lot of people aren't exactly high on South Carolina and sort of seeing that as the game you see it might be.
Well, I just mean, just generically speaking, it's a tough road spot. I'm not making a prediction about how good South Carolina won't be. I will say this. If you go on the road to South Carolina in 2020, that's an easy game, then Muschamp's on his way out the door. He is on his way out the door at that point.
That's the real thing South Carolina might be looking at a year from now, because I don't think anyone thinks this year they're going to overachieve and win 8, 9, 10 games. I think it's going to be a real struggle for them this year with that schedule. And, there's a real chance when Georgia comes into South Carolina in that November 7th game, that game could kind of be Muschamp's last stand. Now, of course, 2014, the Georgia-Florida game was seen as Muschamp's last stand. He won that game, and he still ended up getting fired. So, who knows with that. But
here's what I think is going to determine the future of Muschamp at South Carolina. They've got Tavian Feaster coming in as a transfer. They've got Marshawn Lloyd, at least right now, coming in as a commit to the program. Can Muschamp, can Brian McClendon, can they find a running game? If they cannot, then Muschamp's going to be working on TV or, going to be an NFL defensive coordinator. I really don't know what the next move for Muschamp would be if he fails as an SEC coach for the second time. I'm not sure. But if they don't find this running game with some of the running backs they're bringing in, then they're all going to be looking for jobs, I believe. Mm-hmm. All right, so good stuff. Connor, I appreciate you. Thanks to all of you for being a part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Make sure you check out R.S. Andrews for all your air, heating, plumbing, electric needs. If your air conditioning's not really cooling down your house the way that you want it to, then make sure you check out that Smiley $99 tune-up. That's a great deal. It's a great way to get your system back to factory fresh specs. But you've got to check out Daring the whole gang over at R.S. Andrews to take advantage of that. You can find them online at rsandrews.com. You'll have a great day. I'll see you back here tomorrow for a very busy Friday show. It's already kind of falling into place right here on DawgNation Daily. We'll talk to you then.